Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good break. Um, we now transition from government, which I'm pretty sure all of you had with me last semester, to economics. And today we're going to get our introductory lecture out of the way. Um, my plan is to see if I can't get through this um, in roughly a class period. Uh, but if I need to, and I've got a clock going right now, I'm going to try to cap it at about a half an hour. So if I've got to split it up into two shorter videos, I will do that. Um, we'll just kind of see how things go. Keeping in mind too that as you're going, you know, especially if my goal is for you guys to be able to watch this all together. Um, but if that doesn't work out and you're watching this on your own um, through your own headphones, then you can always pause a slide so that you can get all the words written in. You can always pause if there's something that I say that's not on the slides that is important, which we will do a fair bit of that as well. There's a couple of sections here where we'll get into some examples where you'll need to just be listening. You all should get a hard copy of these notes. It should look something like this. It'll say, "What is economics?" and it'll say student copy at the top. And it's fill in the blanks. So again, you just got to follow along. You can see there, we'll get into some examples. And then when we get down here to, I believe it's section 3, we will get into a graph, our first graph of the year or of the semester, rather. So make sure that you're following along. The sub will be checking your notes at the conclusion of the lecture, whether that's today, Thursday, or whether that's tomorrow, Friday. Just however the time works out, the sub will be checking to ensure that you have taken all the notes, and they will be recording. They will be recording, sort of on a scale of 1 to 10 as to whether or not you got all the notes or not. So as long as you're paying attention, as long as you're writing everything down, you should be fine. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. The first thing that we're going to talk about this semester is obviously what is economics. And this is our working definition of economics. Economics is the study of how society allocates its scarce resources. And when we use that term allocates just means determines who gets what. Okay. So who gets, it says their money. Economics is not necessarily about money, but who gets money in the form of wages? How do we determine that? It doesn't have to be about money, though. It could be about natural resources. Who gets access to natural resources? Who gets food? It could be something as simple as food. Who gets access to what food? It could be who gets access to, you could even get into less what we would call tangible resources. Who gets access to education, right? Who gets access to intellectual property, right? So books, movies, anything like that. That's what economics is, the study of how society allocates its scarce resources. And we're going to talk about scarcity here in a little bit. But suffice it to say, scarcity just means that there's a limited amount of something. And again, we're going to get into that here in a minute. Now, there are various scales of economics, and you can see the 4 there that you need to get recorded. There's individual, that's sort of your personal finance, which in this course, we will do a fair bit on personal finance. That is, I think, we get into the local economics, the national economics, and the world economics. My goal for this class is not that you have this intimate understanding of how world markets work. If we get into that and you're able to take something along those lines away from this course, then that's great. My goal is that you have, though, a better understanding of how economics affects you and how it really affects your personal finance. Okay. So individual economics, we are going to do a fair bit about local and a little bit about national as well when we start talking about sort of broader markets, supply and demand, things like that. But there again, all of those things still relate sort of to the next level down, if you want to think about it that way. Um, your local economics or your local economic systems are all going to be based on the individual actors and are going to affect the individual actors that sort of make that local market up. The national market, the same sort of way. So, again, the focus of this course, we're going to talk about supply, demand, and all those sort of classical economic things, if you will. But we're going to try to focus as much as we can on what does this all have to do with you? There's going to be times where that's going to be really easy for you to see and times where it's going to be really difficult for you to see. But that's kind of where our focus is here moving forward in this course. Now we're going to jump into scarcity and factors of production and sort of how those two play together a little bit. We'll talk first with scarcity and choice. So the first thing that's there on your outlines and the first thing that we see here on the slide is the difference between needs and wants, okay? And our working definition of a need is something that is essential for survival, okay? And before we go into examples, we will then go into wants, which, again, there's a space there on your paper for examples. We'll come back to that. So we'll skip down to lowercase b, where it says a want. And a want is something that people desire, but is not essential for survival, okay? Now, you've probably done something like this before in another class. Now we'll sort of jump into our examples of needs and wants. There's your basic needs, right? That are things that are needed for your physical survival, right? You need water, you need food, you need shelter, right? Those are kind of the three basic needs. So you might make a little subcategory under needs that are sort of your three basic needs. You need water, you need food, you need shelter. Okay. Those are the three basic things that you need. Okay. Now you can sort of broaden that definition out a little bit, depending on wherever you're at in life, depending on wherever you're at geographically. For example, in my personal situation and in you all's situation very soon here, I need to have a job. Okay. I need to have a way to take care of my family, right? That's something that's very tangible. Tangible meaning we can see it, we can conceptualize it. We may, the true meaning of the word tangible is, we're able to touch it. So like food is something that's very tangible. They could also be intangible, right? So again, a job you might call an intangible need. There's some people that say, love is a need, and there's compelling arguments to be made for that psychologically, right? But those are what needs are. So some of this is kind of up for debate a little bit, but there's also parts of it that are not negotiable at all. You need food, you need water, you need shelter. The rest of it we can maybe disagree on a little bit, but at the end of the day, you got to have food, water, and shelter in order to survive. Now, wants, so when you jump down there and we get into some examples for wants, this is again where we start to get into maybe a little bit of gray area, okay? So believe it or not, your smartphone is a want, right? You may say, well, I need a phone for communication. And you might be right. You may need that phone for communication, but you want a smartphone. Your phone doesn't have to connect to the internet, right? That's not something that is essential for survival, right? That's a want. Now, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to separate those two, but because wants are things that we like to have. We like to have them. We desire them, but they're not essential, right? I want, a certain type of food, for example. So these examples are not always concrete. Um, I may want sort of name brand food items, whatever your favorite food may be, whether it's mac and cheese or ramen noodles or anything like that. Um, I need food. I want a particular type of food, right? Because it's based on my taste. It's based on my desires, right? Um, I may want a better vehicle, for example. Um, the one that I have is just fine, but I desire maybe a better one, right? Or a different one. Okay. So needs versus wants. And again, sometimes it's debatable, but then there's other times where it's pretty obvious as to which one is which. Now we get into the difference between goods and services. So a good, we go back to that that idea of physical or something that's tangible, right? A good is a physical object that someone produces, right? And you may even put something, right? Um, it because you could be talking about something that just sort of naturally occurs in nature, right? Um, Oil, for example, um, or sort of your fossil fuels. They are refined. Obviously, they go through a process of refining, but that basic resource, that's not something that someone can goes out and produces. They refine and it goes through a process that makes it usable for us, but there are some goods that are not produced by humans. Obviously, these are your things that are sort of naturally occurring. But that's what a good is. It's something that's physical that someone produces. Services, then. So again, we're going to jump down to part B before we go into examples. Services are actions or activities that one person performs for another. Okay. And again, just like with needs and wants, there can be overlap with these two things, and we'll get into that here in a minute. But goods are all around us. One of the books that I read for grad school a couple of semesters ago, the book is called Behemoth. It's by a guy named Josh Freeman. It's a phenomenal book. It's a history of sort of large factories, but he opens the book in really a very simple but really kind of genius way, where he says, "Look, I'm sitting in a room where everything around me is made in a factory, right?" And he starts listing off all these different things that are around him: his computer, his pen, his desk, his chair, the clothes that he's wearing. Everything that was around him is a good, right? It's a physical object that somebody produces, right? So when you're talking about examples, it could be literally any physical object, right? That is produced or that is naturally occurring in nature, right? So literally, for examples, you could just write down 3 or 4 things. I mean, could be any of the things that Freeman mentions there in the introduction to that book. It could be your watch, it could be your wallet, it could be your car, it could be the tires on your car, it could be anything. It could be any type of food, anything that is physical that someone produces or that occurs in nature. That is a good. Now, your services, then, those are, and again, a lot of times these things are easy to identify, but then they're a little bit harder when you sit down and you have to kind of explain them. And by the way, I do notice as I look at the physical copy of your notes, B doesn't have anything underneath it that says examples, but there is a pretty large space. You do need to be able to provide some examples. Services are anything that's provided to you, any activity or action that's done for you, right? So this is your food service when you go to when you go to a fast food restaurant. Yes, they're providing you with a good. They are providing you with a physical object, but they are also providing you with the service of cooking that food and then bringing it out to you, right? This is like when you go to a mechanic, right? Your mechanic is going to provide probably some good to you. They're going to have to provide you with a spark plug. They're going to have to provide you with a tire. They're going to have to provide you with whatever it is you need that's going to fix your vehicle. But they are providing the service of taking care of that for you, of putting that tire on, of changing that spark plug, whatever it may be. Some professions like mine, which is teaching, I'm providing a service to you, but I'm not really providing you with a physical good, right? I'm providing you with an education, but there's really no physical. There's a representation of that. You all at the end of this semester, hopefully, you meet all the requirements for graduation, and you'll get a diploma, which is sort of a physical representation of that education, but that's not the education itself, right? So again, a service is when you provide some kind of an action or an activity for or on behalf of someone else. Okay, so we have our differences between goods and services. Now we get into the differences between scarcity and shortage. Okay, and this is a little bit different. Those first two things are a little bit easier to understand because they're things that, again, we recognize anyway. Scarcity and shortage are concepts that you're probably aware of already, but in terms of the minute details, it's probably something that you haven't thought too much about. So that's why we're going to go into this. The first one is scarcity. That's part A, lowercase a. Scarcity is the principle that limited amounts of goods and services are available to meet unlimited wants. I'm going to say that again. It's the principle that limited amounts of goods, and services are available to meet unlimited wants. And number one down there is this: scarcity always exists. You always have scarcity. Okay. You can have different degrees of scarcity, but scarcity always exists. Goods and services are always going to be in some limited supply. Those limits may change. Those limits may get bigger. They may get smaller. But there's always limits. But there's always unlimited want, right? If there's a good, if there's a service out there, there's gonna almost always be somebody who has a desire for that good or that service, right? That's what we mean when we say unlimited wants, right? So scarcity always exists. Now, shortages also always exist, but they're slightly different. A shortage is a situation in which consumers want more of a good or a service than producers are willing to make available at a particular price. So if you're trying to conceptualize the differences between scarcity and shortage, a shortage is a specific type of scarcity, right? Scarcity is sort of your big umbrella, right? Scarcity always exists, but then shortages exist sort of in small pockets underneath that. And it says there, number one, shortages can exist in the short or the long term. This is a little bit like, and it's difficult because I'm going to ask a sort of a rhetorical question that normally I'd be able to look out and see if you're shaking your heads yes or no. But if you've ever gone to order something, in my case it'd be a book, but maybe in your case it's a part for a car or a part for a computer, or maybe you've gone to buy some kind of a product at the store. And when you go to the store to buy the good, the salesperson, or online, if you're buying online, it comes up and it says, "Oh, we're out of stock right now," and you've got to wait, right? That is a short-term shortage, right? We're out of stock now, but the truck is going to be in on Tuesday or whatever. So come back on Tuesday and we'll have more. That's a short-term shortage, right? You are one of many consumers that want that good or that service at that particular price. a lot of times shortages happen. Excuse me. And I don't want to get too much into price right now because that starts to get into supply and demand and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times shortages happen because of a price drop, right? For example, I think I mentioned mac and cheese earlier. Mac and cheese is sort of the fallback example that I have for a lot of these situations. If a box of mac and cheese normally costs you $1, and for whatever reason, and again we'll get into this later, but for whatever reason, the store that sells your favorite brand of mac and cheese drops the price down to 50 cents. What we're going to find out is that most people are going to want to buy more of that product because the price is lower. Well, a lot of times what's going to happen is that so many more people are going to want to buy at that price that it's going to create a shortage in the short term, right? And you just have to produce more. And again, we'll get into all that later. But that's kind of the difference between a shortage and scarcity. Even when that mac and cheese is at $1, it's still scarce. There's still a finite amount of that product that has been produced. The shortage occurs at a particular price. Okay, so we have scarcity and we have shortage. Now, entrepreneurs and the factors of production, and it looks like I'm doing pretty good on time. So I'm going to at least get through this section, and then I'll probably cut it off, cut this video off, and then we'll go over sections 2 and 3, or opportunity costs and the production possibility curves. We'll go over those later. So entrepreneurs and factors of production. It bears in mind, and we'll talk about sort of comparative economic systems. Because this is an economics class that's being taught in the United States, we are talking about capitalism within the free market system. And again, we're going to get into comparative systems later, not here in sort of our introduction. So when we're talking about the entrepreneur, you have a definition there in lowercase a underneath 1. The entrepreneur is a person who decides how to combine resources to create goods and services, right? And so that's kind of what we're talking about here. Now, there's a couple of basic assumptions that we have here. One is that a lot of times we think of an entrepreneur, if you've ever heard of this term before, we often think of them as a businessman or a businesswoman, a business person, but they don't have to be, right? You don't have to be in, quote, business, unquote, to be an entrepreneur. You just have to, contribute intellectually in the decision-making process of how to provide or how to combine resources to create goods and services. Technically, for example, like when you guys probably are unaware of this, but here at the school, we have what's called a school improvement team, right? And the school improvement team sits down and they talk to one another and they make decisions about how to improve the school, right? They are technically sitting down, they're looking at the resources that's available to the school, and they're looking at different ways to create a better service, a better way to provide you with an education. Now, we're not, obviously, we don't think of teachers or administrators that are a part of that school improvement plan as entrepreneurs, but technically that's what they're doing, right? They are giving their input as to how to properly combine our resources in order to provide, it says create, but to provide a particular service, right? The other assumption is that anyone who contributes to determining how resources can be used could be considered an entrepreneur, okay? Now that's a lot of lingo for that sort of basic premise in that lowercase a under number 2 that says, you should go into business, right? Basically, that second assumption that we talk about is where, intellectual property, right? If you've ever, said to anybody, hey, what if you tried this? And they look at you and they say, wow, that's a really good idea, right? you are contributing to this entrepreneurial tradition. Yes, that is a word, actually. So those are sort of our assumptions, but that's what is going on here. And we'll get into what factors of production are right now. Factors of production are the resources that are used to make goods and services. Okay? Factors of production are resources that are used to make goods and services. Now, I'm going to kind of jump back very quickly, and before we finish up on this for the day. Knowing now what factors of production are, that sort of might help some of you understand like what an entrepreneur is. An entrepreneur is at the same time both a consumer of products, but then also of products and of services, but they're also those that create them out of factors of production, right? So they're creators. They're not just consumers, right? If that's another way, hopefully maybe that helps some of you, because I know that this is something that oftentimes gets confusing to students. Entrepreneurs are both consumers and creators, right? So anytime you're participating in that creative process of combining or utilizing factors of production, you are also being an entrepreneur. Okay, you might not be getting paid for it, but you're a part of that process. Now, the factors of production, and we've gone through the definition already. There's three basic types of factors of production. There is land, labor, and it says there human capital, and there is capital. Okay, now land, it says there's natural resources used to produce goods and services. That's, I think, pretty self-explanatory. We live in a rural community, so I think we have a pretty good understanding of what land is. Anything. I mean, walk out of town, 50 feet, and look around, and you see obviously land in the form of farmland, farm ground, and that's sort of a pretty obvious example of natural resources here in this area. But it doesn't have to be farmland. It can be, if there's a vacant lot in a town that somebody buys to build a factory, right, or some kind of place of business, that is also considered land, right? Pretty obvious, right? Labor, and this is where we get into human capital. Labor is the effort people devote to tasks for which they are paid. Okay, now that last part, for which they are paid, that can be a little sticky because you could technically, some people would say, well, you could still participate in, contributing to capital or whatever, entrepreneurship, business, and not get paid. And I would say that you're right, but that's not labor. If you're not getting paid, it's not labor. Okay, it is volunteer work. Now, sometimes, obviously, volunteer work can be forced. You can be sort of voluntold, and you can think of historical examples where people have definitely put in effort to tasks for which they are not paid. And again, historically, I mean, you don't have to look very far to get to the practice of slavery here in the United States. But when we're talking about labor, it's any time that you are paid for a task. That is labor. Okay. And then finally, we have capital. Capital is a human-made resource that is used to produce goods and services. So again, anything that is human-made is capital, right? A lot of times, what we tend to think of when we think of capital is that capital is like money, and money is a form of capital, but it's just one form of capital. Capital is sort of any human-made resource that is used to produce goods and services. So if my timer is correct, we are somewhere just under 30 minutes. And so I'm going to cut this part of the lecture off. So this will end up encapsulating Monday's lecture. So again, the substitute will check here with the last 10 to 15 minutes of class. they'll come around and check, do a quick check on your notes just to make sure that you've got everything filled in. Those grades will go into the grade book either when I have been sent that information by the substitute or somebody from the school, or when I return, I'll look at the subs notes and I'll put sort of your participation in for making sure and going through this lecture. And then tomorrow on Friday, we will finish this up. We will get to opportunity cost, and then also I got to find my mouse here. We'll also then get into the production possibilities curves. So that's it for this lecture.